This is Fight Night, a new podcast from iHeartRadio.
They thought he had robbed the deadliest men in this country. Guys who would not hesitate to blow your head off.
This story from Atlanta, Georgia, has been reported for 50 years. But now, for the first time, you're going to hear what really happened from the people who lived it. Listen and follow Fight Night on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey, hon, what you doing with your phone?
Do flowers have best friends?
I don't know. Hey, look.
Whoa.
Some answers can only be found in nature. Discover the unsearchable. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a trail near you. Brought to you by the United States Forest Service and the Ad Council.
The handicapping games that surround American elections have surpassed the cottage industry status, and now they are full-fledged big money businesses. Gambling websites and betting markets take predictions on winners, losers, on point spreads for almost every U.S. race now. And they sort of amount to a fantasy football league for political nerds. So if political gambling and betting on political races has become the new equivalent of Las Vegas casinos, then the Cook Political Report is the master of card counting. For 36 years, Cook Political Report has been analyzing and rating House, Senate, gubernatorial, and electoral college races, and it's truly the gold standard for handicapping and predicting the winners and losers in every major political race in America. Now, by the time we join you again next week, voters will be voting in every U.S. state that allows early voting, and absentee ballots have been mailed out in every state. The election of 2020 is fully underway, but until the evening of November 3rd, there's no way to know how those votes will go. I'm Clay Aiken. It's Wednesday, October 14th. This week, Politicon is blessed to be able to tap into the mind of one of the Cook Political Report's best card counters, Senate and Governor's Editor, Jessica Taylor. What issues are deciding this year's elections? Which races are the closest? What could be the biggest upset? And is there any info in the polling that might answer, how the heck are we going to get along? You've got probably the most interesting job in the world right now. I'm thinking about accountants and how I know people who are friends of mine who are accountants. Like, you don't bother them between the last 2 weeks of March and the first 2 weeks of April. Just leave them alone. I feel like this is your time right now, and that you're giving us any of it is just incredible. Is this the busiest time in your life right now?
It is. But I have to say, Clay, I'm really excited to be talking to you, because when I was telling my friends, I was like, I'm going to do Clay Aiken's podcast.
And they're like, what? Why? What does that have to do with politics?
I'm a big fan as well. I watched you and voted for you on American Idol. So.
Well, thank you very much. Substantially less partisan that vote was.
Yes.
But I do appreciate it. We were talking, I don't even know where I want to start with you, but the producers and I were talking before you got on a little bit about Cory Gardner, where, have you been watching these SCOTUS hearings today and yesterday?
Here and there. I will say I haven't been watching all of them, simply because, some of the action is occurring off of that. So I've had to do other things today.
Right. We were sort of talking about how, what is the benefit for a Republican like Cory Gardner or a Tom Tillis anymore to do what Democrats would consider the right thing? People know that I'm a Democrat, so I'll own that. But obviously Republicans don't like what Susan Collins did or what Lisa Murkowski did. But, a lot of folks who I know, Democrats, are very upset that Cory Gardner and Tom Tillis and some of these others, Martha McSally, Joni Ernst, who are in somewhat competitive races, didn't join Collins and Murkowski and say, let's wait until after the election. And I say, well, but what is the benefit to them in doing that? Because if I said to you, fellow Democrat, not you, but someone else, if Cory Gardner came out tomorrow and said, you know what, I am not going to vote on this nomination until after the election, would you all of a sudden endorse them? Would you vote for them? And universally from Democrats, that answer is, well, no, because I want Hickenlooper to win and I want a Democrat. And I think, well, then what is the benefit if they're not going to be rewarded? Is there any sign from any of the states where I just mentioned, including Collins, where this Supreme Court nomination and this fight has affected the way either candidate has been polling?
So I think when the vacancy happened, you saw a lot of Republicans that were really eager to sort of turn the page, to turn this conversation back to the courts, which has typically been one of their strongest issues, and sort of help them shore up Senate seats in 2018 after the Kavanaugh hearings. But the important distinction is that year Republicans had an incredibly favorable map, with Democrats running in very deep red states trying to win re-election in places like North Dakota and Indiana and Missouri. And this time it's very much flipped, that Republicans have almost double the number of seats that are up, 23 to just 12 for Democrats. And I think what we have seen, really, Senate Republicans are just, stuck between a rock and a hard place. You're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Where if they don't side with Trump and Republicans overall, really, then they're going to get, a nasty tweet from Trump, and he's going to sort of send their base after them, and they could lose that conservative support there. But if you buck the party, then I think it's the same thing that you're seeing. For instance, Susan Collins did this time. She didn't with Kavanaugh, and I think she paid a price for that very early on, and that ultimately may have sealed her fate. But you had, some local stories that were interviewing people right after that saying, well, will you vote for Collins? Well, conservatives were upset, and independents and Democrats that had backed her before were saying, I don't trust her. I don't, she may be taking this vote right now, but I don't trust that she will in the future. And
so it hasn't moved it back towards her at all. It hasn't helped her, this decision she made.
No, and I think really overall, I think just the idea of just the fact that we're talking about the Supreme Court is not a good issue for Susan Collins. I think she'd rather be talking about, her work with getting, the Paycheck Protection Program and, her bipartisan work. Her ads have really tried to focus on that. But this Supreme Court brings up a very deeply partisan issue, and it reminds voters of why they didn't like her vote on Kavanaugh, why they were sort of so irked to begin with, and really that, she would vote with a Republican Party that many of them are out of step with. And with Gardner, I think ultimately the cake was probably baked before that. He is the Republican incumbent sitting in the most difficult state for Republicans. That Trump lost by 5 points. Trump lost Maine by a smaller, about 3.5 points, but 5 points. And then where we look at where the polls are, it's going to be a double-digit loss for Trump in there. And I think Cory Gardner, I think he's still a pretty conservative Republican. Ultimately, I think, he probably would have also been rather talking about, his the Great Outdoors Act that he and Steve Daines, another vulnerable Republican, got pushed. But Gardner also had to, kind of run to the right there, because the other issue is that a lot of these Republicans could have been facing a primary challenge. Gardner could have. Collins was very much, I think if she hadn't have taken that Kavanaugh vote, she probably would have faced a challenge from the former Republican governor there, Paul LePage, who's sort of a mini Trump, and she could have really been ousted there in a primary. So I think that's what it is that you have to have some fealty to the base in order to survive a primary. And I think that's why you have Trump and sort of the Trump coalition that is looking at all of this through a very base-centric election. But in order to win general elections, that's just making Trump, I think, Trump and Senate Republicans largely out of step with where the electorate has moved. Certainly we saw that, I think, in 2018 with the midterm elections at the House level. And now we are seeing it at the Senate level as well.
Is this all Trump then? Is it Are these Republican senators who are running behind or running far closer than they should be in places like Iowa and Montana? Mm-hmm. Is that primarily because of voters' dissatisfaction with Trump, or is it a Republican brand thing, or is it just certain? Martha McSally, is it just certain candidates are not doing well?
I think it's a combination of all of those. I think Trump is sort of the root cause of the problem for a lot of people, and that you don't have Republicans that in the past 4 years have really done anything to separate themselves. One word that I've sort of heard Democrats say that they've been hearing in focus groups is that they see these Republican senators as enablers of Trump, that they sort of have torn down sort of the guardrails or not respected the guardrails that we typically have there in many regards, as he's sort of, done away, sort of run over democratic norms in many instances. And so I think that's why they aren't sort of willing to give them another look. And so I think
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, so I think that's it in Iowa. But I mean, Joni Ernst is also running behind Trump. Tom Tillis, he's running behind Trump even. There is a Trump coalition that I think is still skeptical of some of these because at various times they have slightly tried to buck the party. But then I also think in a place like South Carolina with Lindsey Graham, I think there's just, he has a deep distrust that has something partly to do with Trump, but I think with just his own sort of, changing positions and really sort of changing who he has been over the past 4 years.
Well, we'll definitely be getting back to that. But I do wonder in places like Arizona or Iowa, are these voters, the reason I asked about it being, is this just a Trump thing, is, I mean, you look at a place like Arizona, which hadn't had Democrat senators in years, and in the span of 2 years, they're about to have only Democrat senators in all likelihood. Are these states like Arizona, are they trending blue, or are they trending blue just for these 2 years? In other words, are they becoming more conservative? I mean, are they becoming more progressive as voters and trending away from the Republican Party? Or is it just a referendum on, we don't like this president, get rid of him, and as soon as you get rid of him, we'll probably go back to being Republicans under, whoever else is next?
Yeah, I've heard this, I think that's something Democrats are sort of trying to understand and will become trying to understand. One Democratic consultant said to me, are we sort of renting these voters for a few years or are we owning them now? But I think that, if the Republican Party stays where it is, they could have lost some of these voters, for decades, really. In Arizona, the biggest shifts that we see are in the Sun Belt. That's where the population is exploding, where you have voters of color increasingly moving to, voters with college degrees. And in Arizona there, Maricopa County around Phoenix is about 60% of the overall vote. And that's typically been very Republican territory.
And older voters too, right? I mean,
and older voters, yes. You have a lot of retirees as well. And I think one of the most telling statistics when we look at least the presidential race is that Trump is now losing voters over 65. And that has a real down ballot effect too. I mean, seniors were one of the most reliable Republican coalitions, but I think that COVID has really turned them away because not only are, these elderly voters, senior citizens, the most susceptible to the virus, and they see him as sort of disregarding safety precautions and downplaying its seriousness, but I mean, they're not able to see their grandchildren. They may have had, friends die of this, or at least, get very, very sick. And so I think that's one reason why we have seen this accelerated change, and whether that continues or not. But yeah, in Arizona, we saw the shift, I think, happening first in 2018. I think Trump has accelerated the shifts that may have been inevitable, but he could have sped it up sort of. And I think that's what we're seeing in Arizona. Also with Martha McSally, I mean, when you lose a Senate race and you have turnaround and you're appointed and then you run another 2 years, I mean, I don't think she was ever on pace to win this one because voters really, after they reject you, and she didn't really sort of change the way that she was running this race at all in the ensuing 2 years. And then I think, Mark Kelly there, an astronaut is sort of the dream profile to run as a candidate who doesn't like astronauts.
Right.
So
worked for John Glenn.
Yeah.
And he's certainly got a high profile. I know I shouldn't be laughing, but I do laugh a little bit at the Martha McSally situation because you really got to be bad to lose 2 seats in 2 years. I'm so sorry. Yeah, I shouldn't be that disrespectful. Sorry, Senator McSally. But
I mean, she has a good story. She does. I remember meeting with her when she was running for the House, and she had just a really impressive story. She was one of the more impressive House candidates that I had seen. She was the first female fighter pilot in the Air Force. She talked about, suing, Donald Rumsfeld and the Defense Department for, religious freedom on base and not having to wear a hijab over overseas. I mean, she was just a very impressive person. And I'm not sure that, I think that, again, she's also someone who, in order to win that primary in 2018, when she had two candidates running very far to the right of her, Kelly Ward, who had challenged John McCain in the previous primary, and then, infamous Sheriff Joe Arpaio, she had to run far to the right. And I think that was sort of not in her natural position, but she's had to sort of keep that position again. And, that may have helped her win a primary, but it doesn't help you win a general election in a state like Arizona. And, I have even had Republicans in the state say to me, if she just really emphasized her bio, she has a really compelling story, but she hasn't really done that.
So if you look at polls and you look at Cook ratings, there are, if I'm not mistaken, you know them far better than anyone else. There are 4 states, I believe, right now that Cook anticipates are likely to flip or could flip to the Democrats, only 1 to the Republicans. So obviously, I'm assuming you're still, how do you have Alabama rated right now?
We have Alabama as a lean Republican, which might be being a little bit generous there. I mean, that's the number 1 state that I think is going to flip. Doug Jones, even though he's outspending former Auburn football coach there, Tommy Tuberville, Roy Moore was such a damaged candidate, and Jones even still just barely beat him. And we're not talking about presidential level of turnout that he'll have to face this time. So when I think of that, then they need, in order to reach at least just 50-50, when you take that, if Democrats start down 1 because of that loss, then they need to flip 4 seats.
And you have 4 set right now. Is Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and North Carolina, are they all at least in the lean Dem category for you?
So just 2 of those are right now. We only have Arizona and Colorado in the lean Dem. We are watching the others very closely, and we will be making race changings in these final few weeks, certainly, if things move. I think Maine is probably the next one I would put on that list. And then North Carolina, for a long time we've thought that was the tipping point state, your home state there. But then we've had a series of
I know. I'm here. Don't get me started on that. But the polls do, and I know Cook has not changed it to.
We have not
changed it yet.
The very most recent polling that we are seeing out of there is not showing it changing, and there's been some local newspapers there that have interviewed people, and a lot of them still say that they're sticking with. They're going to stick with him, with Cal Cunningham, the former state senator there, Army reservist, because they sort of see the election as bigger than about a person. But I mean,
I'm going to give you some folks to call, girl, because it's been fascinating to me. Empirical evidence that doesn't count for what you guys actually do, real science, I know, but there have been quite a few people who I have spoken to here who I've heard more people talk about skipping that race on the ballot than I think I've ever heard anyone ever talk about skipping a race on a ballot. Just because a lot of folks have been very torn over not wanting to vote for the Republican, but not being comfortable voting for the Democrat. So I was saying to somebody earlier, I'm very interested in seeing the total number of votes for governor here and the total number of votes for senator here, and seeing if how many fewer people voted in the Senate race than did in governor. But assuming the polls are correct right now, and North Carolina does go to Cal Cunningham, what are the other states that really Democrats have even a reasonable chance in? Are Iowa and Montana actually possible for Democrats to win, either one of them?
They very much are. I think Iowa is the next possible state. Joni Ernst is in real trouble there. She's really taken a hit in her favorables. They sort of see her as gone Washington. And, again, this is a state that Trump won by 9 points, and he's dead even with Joe Biden in it right now.
And Montana?
Montana, I think they do as well. This is more of a candidate-driven race. I mean, we've seen the presidential numbers tighten here too, to where Steve Bullock, the governor there, is very much still in it. I've talked with Republicans and Democrats, and this is just, I think Democrats have Bullock up a few points and Republicans think that Daines is up a few points, but it's within the margin of error. And Trump isn't going to win by 20 points here like he did in 2016. I think it's going to be, mid-single digits perhaps, or, maybe a little bit higher than that. So the tighter presidential numbers could certainly help Bullock sort of pull off the upset there.
You also moved Alaska a little bit to the left today. It's still lean Republican, but you moved Alaska to lean Republican instead of likely Republican. What is an Alaska voter? Because they always tend to be a safe state for Republicans, but Lisa Murkowski, right? And so now you're moving Dan Sullivan's race to the left a little bit. What does an Alaska voter look like, and what's going on up there?
So Alaska is a very hard state to poll. Dan Sullivan won this race 6 years ago by defeating Martin Begich, who had won in the 2008, sort of earthquake with President Obama, and Ted Stevens was ousted there, who was under federal investigation and indictment. So a little bit of controversy sort of helped him get in there. And then, of course, Republican 2014 was more of a wave year. They have very unique issues to them. They had a debate this past weekend that I watched. It was all about fisheries, most of it. They're talking about fishing. They're talking about hunting and, wildlife, Pebble Mine there has become a big issue. So, it's a lot about preservation of their lands as well.
And who is the Democrat?
Well, he's a Democrat. He's running as the Democratic nominee, but he's actually an independent. Al Gross. He's an orthopedic surgeon. He's a commercial fisherman. His father actually was a Democrat, wasn't a former attorney general there, but he was a Democratic attorney general under a Republican governor there, Jay Hammond, who helped together they created the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a dividend that goes to all Alaskans each year.
Oh, well, so you're saying that Al Gross is a registered independent, but he is running as the Democrat. He would caucus with the Democrats if he won.
Exactly. But so, he's hoping that sort of that, saying I would caucus with Democrats because I'm sort of fed up with how Republicans have acted over Trump. But, there's still issues where I would be independent. For instance, he's very fiscally conservative. He was really hitting in that debate, a debate with Sullivan, sort of hitting him for not being fiscally conservative enough. Because I think, if there's one sort of, Republican core principle that the Trump administration has just completely obliterated, it's not certainly, fiscal conservatism that we saw that the Tea Party wanted in 2010. So, he's sort of hitting them sort of on that. But, and Alaska is also a very pro-choice state. I think that's where Murkowski is very much in line with the state. And I think, they're kind of hoping that with this, with the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett and, a woman's right to choose and Roe v. Wade being up there, that could sort of move some votes too. So we're seeing tightening there, and Trump has become, he's seen his numbers sink here in Alaska as well. This is a state that has only voted for a Democrat once before for president since it became a state. But we're seeing, Democrats are seeing some encouraging numbers there. Republicans are beginning to get worried. We now have the major Republican super PAC Senate Leadership Fund spending money there. The National Republican Senatorial Committee is going up on air there tomorrow with an ad. And Gross, like so many of this, the other thing to think about with this map, and one reason why it's so large, is that Democrats have just overwhelmed Republicans with the amount of money that they have been able to raise. And a lot of that
was going to be a part of my next question, which was, how do you decide what we're all looking at polls, right? I check my 538 every day, every morning, 5 times a day, see what poll came out, etc. But you guys use so much more when you decide to move a race into a different column. What made you want to move the Alaska race, and what factors do you put into it when you move or don't move other races?
Listen, we talk to a lot of sources of what they're seeing there on the ground. We talk with people that are working in races. We want to sort of get a feel for people that are in state, that are seeing things that we can't, especially this year when we can't travel anywhere. And so, we rely on we get a lot of private data that's shown to us too, that, we can't publish, but influences our ratings. And then, we look at candidate quality and fundraising too. So, I would say that our ratings are a mix of qualitative and quantitative data. And I love 538 as well, but I think they are looking at through a more statistical lens, where I do think that, candidate quality can matter in some of these races. If a wave election, it may not. And that's why I think that's some of the moves that I've made recently, when we're seeing, Biden with a pretty steady, 10-point lead and that 538 average. And it's been, 7-8 points pretty steadily, and has sort of risen since the debate, really. And that has a major down ballot impact. So, I mean, I think Alaska, again, that's a state that you have a candidate there that is sort of unique. He will be listed on the ballot as a Democrat. They had hoped that there was sort of a loophole where he could be listed as an independent, but that ruling went against them. So Republicans hope that could kind of, work in their favor a little bit. And they're, arguing, well, Al Gross, he says he's independent, but Democrats are bankrolling his campaign and all of this, the super PAC money that's coming in. But you're seeing, also, I think it's just when I've watched a lot of these debates, the Senate debates over the past few weeks, and you can just kind of tell when some of these candidates and incumbents are on edge. And I think that debate that I watched over the weekend, you could really see that Sullivan was really just repeatedly, I think he said Chuck Schumer at least a dozen times, we're really worried, and they're trying to tie them to the national party. They're trying to say if Democrats take a majority in the Senate, they would pack the Supreme Court. They would eliminate the filibuster. They would, make DC and Puerto Rico a state. So they're trying, they would push this liberal agenda, as where Republicans are saying. But I think it's sort of missing the forest for the trees in some instance, because I think what most voters are concerned about are health care. And that's an issue which, again, it may have lost Democrats the House in 2010, but it won it back for them in 2018 with so many of its provisions, especially protecting pre-existing conditions that are now vital, and I think even more vital in a pandemic that people are really, really afraid of losing. And Republicans really, for saying for really 6 years that they were going to repeal and replace it, they haven't come up with a viable alternative. And then when you have the Trump administration that is actively suing in court, and that the Supreme Court is going to hear arguments about a week after the election, healthcare is still the biggest issue. And again, I think it's something that's only become magnified amidst this pandemic.
13 days of Halloween. A remote hotel.
This, my friend, is Hawthorne Manor.
The most unusual guests.
They sound like someone you trust.
Trick or treat! No, sweetie, don't touch it. Don't look at it.
A tour guide that can't be trusted.
Was it luck or fate that placed you here? We'll never know.
And the newest arrival is you.
Why are you here again?
I know you can hear me.
Starring Keegan-Michael Key as the caretaker.
Please make yourself at home. After all, this is it.
Produced in three-dimensional binaural audio to place you right in the center of the story in ways you'll have to hear to believe. For full exposure, listen with headphones or AirPods. One story each night, starting October 19th and ending on Halloween. From iHeartRadio and Blumhouse Television, listen to Aaron Mahnke's 13 Days of Halloween on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh, host of the podcast Mating Matters. I believe nearly every human behavior is motivated by a desire for love, sex, or to hedge your reproductive odds.
I think women have this ability to plant these mental bombs into a man's mind.
But the thing about humor is that the value of humor, it goes up.
We're wired to reproduce.
To them, it was a super female. It was a giant female. And they were lured into trying to mate with it.
The science of love is fascinating.
It's a bizarre form of biohacking, really.
If you have the 7R+ gene, you are more likely to be involved in an affair, yes.
That's where some of the research gets really intriguing.
There's so many ways to be a human.
But I must say, sex between three people can get complicated.
In a nutshell, the Kinsey scale looked at two things: sexual fantasies and actual sexual behavior.
Listen to Mating Matters on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Well, you talked about money, and so, and I'm curious, obviously, as to how much fundraising goes into your decisions as to where to place a candidate, what category to put a race in. I got to say, I mean, I was floored when you moved South Carolina to toss up. You're from the South, and you went to school in South Carolina, right?
I did.
So you know South Carolina.
Furman University.
What the hell is going on there? I mean, seriously, the idea that it's even possible for Lindsey Graham to lose there. I always assumed Lindsey Graham would go out in a primary.
Yeah.
Never in a general. So the fact that you have South Carolina is a toss-up. I'll be honest, I'm just saying, okay, it's nice and pretty to look at, but I mean, come on, we know he's gonna pull it off. But if Cook Political Report says it's a toss-up, I have to think there's a real chance that Harrison could pull it off. Tell me all about South Carolina, because I'm fascinated.
Yeah, I mean, it's my favorite race too to look at. I think, again, because as you said, I've spent time there in college and a lot of time back thereafter with friends that have stayed in the state. And, there's just something going on there. And I think that, first of all, there's a lot of Republicans that are really sort of frustrated at Graham that he really sort of didn't take this race seriously enough. I think you're right. I think he thought no one has changed more than Lindsey Graham, I think, over the past few years, because, I mean, this is a man who called, Trump a race-baiting, xenophobic, religious bigot. And now he's, golfing buddies with him.
But is it that disingenuousness? Is it the hypocrisy that are making people not like him? Or is it the supporting of Trump, period?
I think that Graham was able to win, independents and Democrats in the state, because I think they looked at him and saw, okay, he's probably as good as we could do as well. Right. And so he got a lot of crossover voters. And now Democrats have a real candidate to vote for. And then I think that disingenuousness, it's not completely repaired his image with even conservatives. So, when I dug into some of the crosstabs here, Graham still is struggling with even just base Republican voters. And then still, yeah, I mean, it's improved somewhat, but this wasn't a Quinnipiac poll. 50% of people say that he is not trustworthy. And only 3/4 of Republicans think he is honest. And I think
those are high numbers, if you ask me. I'm surprised.
Yeah, it is. and then the Supreme Court, I think he really thought, again, that since he's Senate Judiciary Chairman, that, again, the Barrett nomination would sort of bring people back. But then he had his, hold the tape if there's another vacancy during the Trump term and we won't fill it like we did with Merrick Garland. And that was just playing ad nauseum across the state. I heard from multiple people. And I think that really sort of played into can we really trust him? And then there's another sort of thing here at play that I think is an undercurrent, not just the trust that sort of plays into that distrust. And I've heard this, that Democrats say is brought up repeatedly in focus groups. It's not just that he's, sort of switched on Trump and became Lindsey Graham's best friend in the Senate was John McCain, and they were, inseparable. And I think a lot of people saw, how could you be so close to this president that repeatedly mocked John McCain
and continues to
and denigrated his service? Right, exactly. While he was sick, before he was sick, and after he died. So I think that really kind of cast this, really sort of questioned his, ethics and credibility, really. And so I think that's sort of an undercurrent that I think is happening here as well. And I mean, Jamie Harrison needed a lot of things to go right. And everything has so far, where I think, again, Lindsey Graham's numbers were softer than we believed. And he's really energizing African-American voters for the first time in the state. Again, Democrats have a credible candidate, and he's speaking very bipartisan in a way. I think another thing, if you watch some of his ads, they are a lot of white, older women saying, I voted for Lindsey Graham for a long time, but I don't trust him. I don't trust him on healthcare. I don't trust him to make the right decisions anymore. So it's sort of saying to, women voters especially, it's okay. You can cross party lines. And I think that's happening some. And I think he's winning over, some white college educated women too. And, in places like Greenville, where I went to college. I mean, Charleston, we've seen a massive shift there. Of course, Joe Cunningham flipped that House seat in 2018, and he's on pace to pretty easily win it again, it looks like. So there are pockets of South Carolina. Certainly it's still, I think, conservative at its core. And of course, those rural areas are still going to be very conservative. But, just something's happening there.
Well, at the risk of talking too much about South Carolina, we're going to do some episodes on swing states. So I want to really get as much info on South Carolina as I can because it's not a swing state. What's going to make the difference on election day or in the early voting days in South Carolina? What's going to make the difference for Lindsey Graham or Jamie Harrison to move it out of toss-up? Is it a persuasion thing for Jamie Harrison that he needs to continue to persuade more voters? Is it a turnout thing? If you had $58 million to spend and you were Jamie Harrison, how would you spend it? Would you spend it on ads or would you spend it on field? Getting people to the polls.
He has it to spend on both when you have that much.
Well, when you have that much in South Carolina, you can buy the TV station.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I don't think he's going to be wanting for reasons. There's a couple of things I would watch here, though, too. I think he's going to spend it on field and motivation. And if he can really get African-American voters out at historic levels in the state. And I think if turnout is up overall, really, we've even seen long lines forming, in the first few days of early voting there last week. And I think that's sort of indicative of a level of enthusiasm that we really haven't seen. And here's something else to watch. I was hesitant to move this for a long time, even though the polls were showing this, dead tight, because I do think a Democrat in a state like South Carolina has a ceiling of about 48% of the vote. Mm-hmm. There is a third party candidate on the ballot.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. We're on the same wavelength.
The Constitution Party candidate. Now he has dropped out of the race and endorsed Lindsey Graham, but he still remains on the ballot.
And Harrison's running ads for him or against him, right?
Yes, he's running digital ads, sort of trying to prop up Bledsoe and so that's sort of, I think, the strategy too. And Democrats were sort of talking about this quietly, and now it's, I think, very much more out in the open that, if they can sort of, I think that's where it goes to, okay, you don't like Lindsey, you don't have to vote for him. There is a Trump conservative, quote unquote, on the ballot. You can cast that vote. So if he brings Graham's total down enough, he doesn't have to win with 50% of the vote. He can win with, 47, 48%.
That whole, again, South Carolina just blowing my mind this time. I want to talk a little bit about presidential politics too, because you know the states and the whole states everywhere. But before we move to that, just a quick, brief brush on gubernatorial races. I know you cover those for Cook also. There really aren't even any competitive races in the country this year in the governor's mansions, are there?
So I think the most competitive one is probably Montana. We rate that one as a toss-up. An open seat there with Steve Bullock, term limited and running for governor. It's the only race we have in a toss-up. Greg Gianforte, the congressman there, who you may remember from his body slamming a reporter, is running against Democratic Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney. We've seen Gianforte get a little bit of a polling lead there. I still think it could be really tight, really close though, but Gianforte I might give a slight edge to. And, Democrats really came back in governor's races over in 2018 and in 2019 to the point where they're almost now at near parity, which they were at record lows in 2016. So Republicans overall still have 26 of the governorships. Democrats have 24. That Montana seat could add one for Republicans if they flip it from Democrat to Republican, which again, you think of Montana as a pretty red state, but they've actually held the governor's mansion there for 16 years now.
And interestingly too, Vermont's had a Republican governor for a hot second too, hasn't it? What is that all about?
Well, and New Hampshire. Yeah, Vermont. I rate that race now as solid Republican. So the only two states that still elect their governors to 2-year terms are New Hampshire and Vermont. So those are up every 2 years. Phil Scott has, I think, shown how to be a New England Republican, but I think that's much easier to do when you're a governor and you're not in sort of federal, pressure like Susan Collins is. So he can criticize Trump. He said he's not going to vote for Trump. He might vote for Joe Biden. He's also, his approval rating on his handling of coronavirus is in the 80%. So he's got really high approval ratings. He's got a lot of crossover support, even from Democrats. He's going to easily win that race. And, again, it is really sort of unfathomable that, a state like Vermont can have a Republican governor. But he's someone who has not had blowback because he's broken with his party and with Trump.
So, with the exception of Vermont, which clearly votes very independently with all their races, we're kind of headed towards a place, it seems like, when I look at these maps, where the states all have an identity. I guess I'm thinking back to, 10, 15, 20 years ago at the most, when so many states split their senators. You'd have a Republican and a Democrat. And after this election, if things go the way Cook is handicapping them, Alabama will be back to 2 Republicans. Arizona will likely be back to will be at 2 Democrats. Colorado will be at 2 Democrats. Heck, even Montana might be at 2 Democrats. We're getting to a place where very few states have senators from different parties. I think what Wisconsin does, West Virginia does. They're just not many. Are we that polarized to where even within a state, it's all based on how you vote at the national level?
We are. It's almost become parliamentary in the way that we have elections. Pew has done some research on that, Pew Research Center, which is another really great resource. And, back in like 84, you actually, and, 86 and 88, you actually did have more Republicans, more just senators that represented states that had their presidential results differed from their own party preference. Right now, 77% of senators are from the same party as their last presidential vote.
I was fascinated to learn that North Carolina has not split its senator president ticket since 1964.
Did not know that.
I didn't know that either. And that may be a reason that it's not time to move North Carolina out of toss-up in the Senate column until we know what's going on.
I think it's just very close. Even before the Cunningham scandal, even when it was showing him with wider leads, I was having Democrats tell me, we think this is going to tighten. We think that this is going to tighten. I think just the presidential race is going to be very close. I think the Senate race, especially now, and perhaps even before, was going to be very close. But, going back to governor's races for a minute there, like Roy Cooper, I think is going to win re-election very easily. He's someone that I think is, has some cross-party appeal there, and is definitely going to pick off some Trump voters too. So he's going to, I think, win another term pretty easily there.
But those states that Arizona is about to elect its second Democrat to the Senate and is very likely to vote for Trump as well. What about Florida?
I don't know that Arizona is going to vote for Trump. We actually have
I'm being hopeful. I told you I'm a Democrat girl. I'm going to be hopeful. Yeah. What's going on in Florida, though?
Florida, I think, we have this, Florida's sort of the ultimate toss-up, really.
Is it smart for a Marco Rubio who's got to run again in 2 years? Is it smart for him to be so supporting Trump so much? Should he be reading the writing on the wall here and seeing that his state isn't as in love with Donald Trump as he is right now?
I think there's going to be a reckoning of some of these senators that are up in 2022 and just of the Republican Party overall of, what if, do they sort of keep those Trumpian elements of the party, or are they going to see both 2018 and looks increasingly likely like 2020 that is going to be a rejection of that? Florida, again, I think this is a place where you see the senior vote is obviously hugely important, and we are seeing that moving away from Trump and toward Biden. But Biden, I think another thing to watch here in Florida is that, Biden still, I think, has a problem with some sections of the Hispanic vote. Cuban Americans here, especially in Florida, are typically more conservative than some Latino voters, for instance, in Arizona. So I think that Trump could still make some inroads there, when he talks about socialism and sort of the threat of that's something that resonates with, Cuban American families or Venezuelan American families, perhaps more. I think it's going to be very close, but I will say, another thing that obviously I think is sort of at the back of a lot of our minds is that, are we going to know on election night who wins, or is Trump going to try to sort of declare victory? Because we do expect the sort of election day vote to favor him, but, the mail-in vote and early vote to favor Democrats. But I think Florida could really tell us very early on because they are a state that is expected.
They've already started counting, haven't they?
Right, exactly. They've already started counting, and who would have thought 20 years later after 2000 that we would be saying we're going to trust Florida's going to be right the first we trust right now. This really could be the case, and Florida with his 29 electoral votes. If Trump loses Florida, there is essentially no path for him to 270.
And the other state that may also not make it possible for Trump to win if he doesn't win, correct me if I'm wrong, Pennsylvania is on the other end of that spectrum when it comes to counting ballots. They are, tell me if I'm wrong here, they are a state that doesn't begin their absentee ballot counting until election day. Is that right?
I think that is,
but they're also one of the only other states that have two senators from different parties. So is it still a swing state? Is it?
Although Pat Toomey there has already said that he is not going to.
Why do you think that is?
Re-election. I think he sees the state is changing. We kind of expected him to run for governor, but he's not. And I think that he may be sort of seeing the tea leaves too. So, we have our first vacancy of 2022, which I'm not even going to think about until after this is over. I do think it's certainly changing. So.
Well, my producers want me to ask you about the state that is going to keep you busy after this election, Georgia, because you'll still have a race to worry about in Georgia in January. Who's it going to be between in January?
So I will say it might not just be one race; it could be two races. We have the two races happening in Georgia, and in that regular election between David Perdue and Jon Ossoff, if no candidate gets to 50% in that race either.
Wait, what? Okay, but what you just blew my mind. I didn't know this. That matters there too?
It does.
Shut up.
Yeah, it's happened before. In 2008, that race went to a runoff as well. The Republican ended up winning easily, Saxby Chambliss. But yeah, Georgia's election law that a candidate has to get 50%. So that one could be going to a runoff.
Is there a third party candidate in that Ossoff-Perdue race?
There's a libertarian that could sort of take off some of the vote, and Republicans and Democrats that I've talked to, probably well over a dozen in the past few weeks, believe that is going to happen. So I think we're going to have two races there. And then the other one, which I know is the one you're about, is the special election. So this is a jungle primary because it's a special election, and the appointed senator is Kelly Loeffler. And, she was appointed by Brian Kemp sort of over the, protests of the White House, because I think he did sort of see the writing on the wall that happened in 2018 in those Atlanta suburbs, that they needed someone that could appeal to, sort of suburban women. And so Loeffler, she's a businesswoman. Her husband owns the parent company of the New York Stock Exchange. She's part owner of the Atlanta Dream, the WNBA franchise there. But then you had Doug Collins that got in and sort of ruined their plans. This is who the White House wanted to appoint, one of the fiercest defenders of Trump during the impeachment hearings. And he forced her to sort of have to run to the right and to sort of prove her conservative bona fides. And now they are just running as far to the right as is humanly possible. I mean, Loeffler is even running an ad where, not just one ad, there's a series of ads where she talks about, says that she's more conservative than Attila the Hun.
Oh, I saw that one. Brilliant.
There's three of them. I'm not exactly sure how that appeals to suburban women in Atlanta.
But she's running ahead of him right now as Collins, correct?
She is now again. Yeah, she had, I think, a sort of a rocky launch with some questions about stock trades that she made, but she's recovered from that. And Collins just doesn't have money right now, and she's self-funding her race. I mean, she's a multimillionaire, she and her husband are. But I think that this is a race I moved as well today into the toss-up column because I think it's become clear that it is going to be a Democrat and a Republican. And the most likely Democrat there, who is now polling in first, is Raphael Warnock. He's African-American pastor, leads the Ebenezer Baptist Church there in Atlanta, which is Martin Luther King's church, so a very historic church. And I think he, has the potential to, again, sort of energize African-American voters in the state in a way that Stacey Abrams did as well. And, when I looked at this, and especially with both races sort of going to that, David Perdue has run sort of more of a, not fully moderate campaign, but not certainly as far to the right as Kelly Loeffler has. I mean, she and Collins are sort of, you see them sort of pandering to the right. She's appeared with, Marjorie Taylor Greene, that's the QAnon candidate down there that's going to win a congressional race. So I just find it really hard of how she's going to sort of move toward the middle in the 2 months of the ensuing runoff. And so I think that
having a second race in January would hurt her likely more, because she'd be. My mind again. You've blown my mind so many times tonight that you can run. That they may have a Perdue Ossoff race and a Loeffler Warnock race on the same ballot in January.
Yeah.
If Georgia's anything like North Carolina, and I know that there are plenty of similarities, I would imagine there will be a lot of people who will split it just for pragmatic reasons. I'm going to vote for one Republican and one Democrat. And if I'm splitting it, I probably vote for Perdue and Warnock, because Kelly Loeffler is Attila the Hun. Right? Yeah. So it could be really interesting.
I think we won't fully know the dynamics of one or both of those runoffs until we know the presidential race and the Senate numbers too. Are these two races that could determine Senate control, or could it determine how big Democrats' Senate majority could be? I mean, we could not know who controls the Senate until January. And then, what's the outcome of the presidential election? If Biden wins, can Democrats sort of keep up that energy all the way to January? Do dejected Trump voters not turn out, or are they sort of re-energized? I think there's just a lot of unknowns that we
right. And then the National Party has nothing else to do in November, December, and January, ostensibly. So maybe they throw more money into it. I want to move on to quickfire. We ask our listeners to send in questions for our guest every week. You can do that at podcasts@politicon.com via email, podcasts@politicon.com, or send them to us on Twitter or Instagram @Politicon. These questions were sent in specifically for you tonight. And looks as if though I have accidentally asked half of them myself, because I've been so fascinated. But let's try. Ophelia from San Francisco asks, does raising $58 matter?
58.
I'm sorry, $58 million. Does raising $58 million matter? $58 might not. $58 million, does it matter?
I think it does. I mean, Harrison has, I think the money sort of got him noticed sort of early on and forced Graham into a defensive posture. And I don't think, if he was raising this money early on, Graham would have been there. And, again, we say it's, may seem hard to us about how to spend that money in South Carolina, but multiple people I've talked to are like, there's ways you can spend it. You can run these more targeted ads. You can do digital ads. You can do voter outreach. I mean, my goodness, for that much, you could have someone drive each individual person to the polls.
Right. But at some point, is it just, if money mattered that much, wouldn't Amy McGrath be closer to Mitch McConnell?
That's a good point. I think this is where candidate quality comes in. I do. Amy McGrath had some very early missteps. I don't think she's been running as sort of targeted and as strong of a campaign. And Harrison, I think just, when we look at this is again why we use sort of qualitative and quantitative data to sort of make these determinations. I think that Harrison has been a better campaigner. Really, and McGrath sort of never really found her sea legs, really. So I do think the money in Kentucky is, is perhaps diminishing returns. But also remember, Kentucky, Trump won that state by 30 points. Trump only won South Carolina by 14 points. And I think South Carolina also, you have a much higher African-American population than you do in Kentucky at all. And when you have an African-American candidate, think of this too. If Jamie Harrison wins, South Carolina, the place where the Civil War started, would be the first state in history to have 2 black senators.
Right. I know. And if Jamie Harrison doesn't win, then he's coming for Tim Scott in 2 years, probably.
Governor, I think he could run for governor.
Oh, interesting.
That might, we see some Southern governors, Andy Beshear in Kentucky, John Bel Edwards in Louisiana.
Right.
So he could have
and South Carolina has had a Democrat governor far more recently than it has had a Democrat senator.
Yeah.
Emily from Virginia Beach asks, well, I'm going to save that one. Let me ask, Nate from Durham. Oh, hey, Nate from Durham. Oh, he asks, do sexting scandals still matter in 2020?
Right now, it doesn't look like it does. I think, Republicans still it sounds like we might actually get a Tillis poll out tomorrow. So we'll see what his numbers say. I do feel like they've been a little more encouraged in recent days by this, or like you were saying, your friends there, do they skip that race? I think it's just what else comes out. I don't think Cunningham has done a good job of managing this. I think he should have gotten out ahead of it. Although he did put out the news on perhaps the, best day that he could when, the president.
When Tillis had just gotten coronavirus too.
Well, and Kellyanne Conway and Bill Stepien, Trump's campaign manager. I mean, it was just felt like every hour somebody else was confirmed to get coronavirus.
I will say the question on the poll that was just released this week, Survey USA just did a poll, I guess came out yesterday, the day before, giving my own personal opinion here, which I often do. I was surprised by the question because the question asked specifically sort of what Nate asked. Do sexting scandals, does marital infidelity, does that matter to you? And I don't believe, at least from the ads that I see in North Carolina, that Tom Tillis is running against the infidelity or running against the fact that Cal Cunningham cheated on his wife, but he is running against what people might see as hypocrisy or dishonesty. Yeah. Sort of the same thing that's hurt Lindsay Graham in South Carolina. Right. And that question wasn't asked. The question was, and I think for the most part, all these people who I've talked to, they don't really have a problem with the infidelity. Well, we've got a president who grabs women by the privates. So that's not the issue. The issue is you ran a certain way, and in the middle of your election, you pulled a John Edwards, which, we did that already in North Carolina. Yeah. So I think that poll didn't really answer the question.
Yeah,
that I think needs to be answered.
Voters said it didn't affect their vote, but I think some of them were probably with Cunningham. I will just throw out this stat and do with it what you will. When I looked at that poll and I looked at the one that they had done in September, Tillis was actually leading among men by 11 points. In this new poll, Cunningham was leading among men by 2 points. So Cunningham will lead with men. So, read into that what you will.
Well, this is why, Jessica, you're the pro. You get into the weeds and get into all those crosstabs. So last question. Emily from Virginia Beach asks, what could be the biggest upsets? And then she puts in parentheses, only one right answer. I don't know what that part means, but what do you think the biggest upsets could be this year across the board?
I think that Alaska race would qualify as an upset. And I think, South Carolina, even though we rate it as competitive, in talking with you here, I think this is what a lot of Southern Democrats have. They sort of can't believe that their states are changing or that they could be in play. And I think that's sort of the same thing happening in South Carolina. So again, I think if Jamie Harrison were to win, you have a state like South Carolina, like I mentioned, that has such a fraught racial history, would have 2 African-American senators. I think that sends a huge message.
Yeah.
That certainly would be a massive upset too.
I guess it depends, Emily, on how you define, Emily, the listener, on how you define upset. If it's a sleeper race, Alaska, no one's really paying attention to it. Surprise, Democrats got another seat. But if you want to talk about a Eric Cantor-sized what the heck, or an AOC beating in the certainly if Lindsey Graham is probably the most visible, at least one of the most visible senators in the Senate, to have him lose would be
partly why Harrison is getting a lot of money in the same way that Amy McGrath gets a lot of money. It's about who they're running against, too. Not that Harrison is not a compelling candidate. He very clearly is. But I think a lot of that money is because, Lindsay Graham has said it repeatedly on Fox News and in the hearings this morning that, they hate me. They really hate me. And that is true for, most of both of their money comes in from out of state, which is really the norm in most of these races now. And we saw a lot of it come in the, hours and days after Justice Ginsburg's death. And I think that was a major part that was fueling that, $57 million as well. So, yeah, I think we will see what happens on election night.
And I'm sure you're ready for that. So the point of this podcast is to try to figure out how, the question I was asking earlier about partisanship and how we've just, it really is just, are you red or are you blue? And you vote that way. And, I get frustrated because I'm blue, but I still am frustrated by the fact that, what's the point of trying to be moderate? Because if you are like Susan Collins, it doesn't matter. You're not.
Yeah.
You weren't blue enough. Or if you try to be moderate, Cory Gardner has no motivation for appeasing the people in the middle because Democrats won't vote for him anyway. Mm-hmm. So the purpose of the podcast is to try to figure out why we've become so partisan. And if we're going to stay partisan, how can we live together? So I asked the same question of everybody at the end. You dig into what's going on in all of these states. You get to see the partisanship more than most people do because you're really looking at it. How the heck are we going to get along?
Well, I think there are some encouraging signs that we can look at. A lot of these, House members that were elected in 2018 that really are sort of moderate or have, very military backgrounds or national security backgrounds, like Abigail Spanberger, for instance, look like they're going to win again. And I think there is some sort of moderation there in the House. And then, some of these senators that could get elected, these Democratic senators, I don't think they're going to be ideologues. I don't think Jamie Harrison is. He's running on a very, pragmatic position. Mark Kelly in Arizona, sort of the same way. Cal Cunningham, if he overcomes the sexting, I think would be the same again. So, I'm not sure, but then you're right. We do lose, sort of those Republican moderates that have worked across the aisle, like Susan Collins. We lost a lot of those Democrats in 2018 as well. Claire McCaskill, Joe Donnelly, Heidi Heitkamp too. So, I do think though, Democrats are not running, very liberal candidates in some of these states. So, does that stay? Because certainly Republicans are trying to sort of paint them as, sort of AOC acolytes and stuff too. And I'm not sure that's resonating with voters. And then I think a lot of it comes down to, what does the Republican Party look like post-Trump? I know a lot of Republicans are wondering that themselves. And we just don't really know.
And whether the Democrats also, by the way, are able to embrace and accept those moderate Democrats who do win. Because if Steve Bullock were to win in Montana, he would likely do a lot of what Joe Manchin does in West Virginia. Right. Are Democrats going to be reasonable enough to realize we shouldn't primary him in 6 years because we should be happy we have a senator, two senators from Montana who are Democrats, and we shouldn't be trying to put AOCs in Arizona against Mark Kelly.
You see some of that happening. I think that's sort of the Democrats have to be cautious. And I will say, we have seen a lot of times when either party sort of gets unified control, that can sort of go to their heads a little bit, you know. Democrats got a major backlash after, Obama won and they had unified control, and then they lost the House 2 years later. Well, Trump won, they had unified control, they lose the House 2 years later again. And I think that overreaching is something that voters sort of don't like. And I think Democrats are going to really have to be cautious, because you mentioned there, I don't think a Joe Manchin, I don't think a Steve Bullock is going to, a Mark Kelly, it doesn't look like they would, go along with, some of the more, progressive things that people are pushing for, like abolishing the filibuster. I think there's a lot of people that would be more institutionalists, perhaps in there. And I think Joe Manchin would be, someone as well. But I do think that, it depends on which elements of the Democratic Party sort of continue to reign supreme. And, politics is about ebbs and flows. Democrats are up sometimes, Republicans are down sometimes, and right now I think Democrats are rising, but I think they have to sort of, they sort of can't let that power go to their head or overreach again, because voters have a way of sort of bringing them back down to reality. And, I think that's sort of maybe how our system is supposed to work. Those checks are supposed to be there.
Well, I'll say that it gives me great hope, or I guess that's the word, that in your Cook ratings, you have, I think, 14 races of the ones that are up to 30, how many up this year? 35, that are up this year, that are in the lean or the toss-up category. So a lot more towards the middle, in on lean or toss-up than certainly your counterpart at the House has. There are just not many competitive seats in the House anymore. And the fact that there are some in the Senate is nice.
Yeah, I mean, and that's I think because of redistricting too, and we're going to redraw these lines after this election and stuff too. And I hope that one thing to maybe take away is I think we are seeing people getting engaged, and I think this is going to be the highest turnout presidential election that we've ever seen. 140 million, 150 million, and I think just when more people participate in the process, I think that's just good for democracy.
I think that is the perfect place to leave it. I agree with you completely. If you don't know about the Cook Political Report, if you're listening to us, you know who the Cook Political Report is. They are absolutely the leaders and the best at what they do when it comes to handicapping these races. Almost 40 years of doing it, and I would be lost without them. Probably a little too expensive for people to subscribe to 100%, like full year round. But definitely, when you see Cook Political Report, you know that you can count on their race ratings to kind of give you an idea of where things are going. And I have to say, personally and selfishly, when I ran for Congress, Dave Wasserman interviewed me, and he moved my race from solid Republican to likely Republican. And that was a huge compliment for me in a very, very red race that he thought it was slightly less red than it was before I ran.
I mean, you can get just a monthly subscription for $35, certainly.
And it's worth it. And it might be worth doing this month. This is a good time to get it. You're right. So I cannot thank you enough, Jessica. I could talk to you all night long, and I really appreciate it. Jessica Taylor from the Cook Political Report. Guys, if you've listened and you've enjoyed it, please rate us and review and like and subscribe and do all that fancy stuff. Go check out Cook Political Report and read Jessica's stories and her updates on gubernatorial and Senate races. And join us back here next week for the next episode of How the Heck Are We Gonna Get Along?
On September 17th, 2009, 24-year-old Mitrice Richardson disappeared without a trace in the woods near Malibu, California, and was never seen alive again. I'm Katherine Townsend, host of the podcast Hell and Gone. We're going to try to find out what really happened to Mitrice Richardson. School of Humans and iHeartRadio present Hell and Gone Season 3. Listen to Hell and Gone on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
After you listen to today's podcast, here's one to add to your playlist. I'm Christian O'Connell, and I've had this thought for a while. What if you took the world's funniest and most interesting people...
Hello, I'm Ricky Gervais.
Celeste Barber. Some people call me Beyonce.
I'm Russell Brand.
And asked them to share the stories behind their 3 most treasured items.
No doubt about it, the guitar. I think I know the same chords now as I did when I was 14.
From iHeartRadio, this is The Stuff of Legends. Add it to your playlist for free. Just search for Stuff of Legends in your podcast app.